Hello, this is Lily Mott, and welcome to Communications 151. So I'm going to do a voiceover for these PowerPoints so that way we get all the information that we need. So some things that we're going to talk about for Chapter 1 are the reasons why we need to communicate with one another, the nature and types of communication. So basically, how do we communicate and why do we communicate? We're going to talk about some myths when it comes to communicating, and then also communication competence. And that just means that you know how to properly communicate with various types of people and in various types of situations. Why we communicate. So we communicate for the following reasons. Physical needs could encompass the fact that as humans, we are not meant to be alone. We will have failure to thrive if we don't have touch and feeling. If you think about people that are in solitary confinement in jail, the reason why it's like a difficult punishment is because they're not around other people. They're not talking to other people. They're not touching other people. And that really affects the mind. So actually, solitary confinement can make people go crazy. And there have been some experiments that would definitely not be allowed today, but basically where they performed an experiment, giving babies physical needs as far as touching them, holding them, loving on them, and then having babies not receive any love. And the babies that did not receive any love had failure to thrive, and they eventually died. Now, this was way back in the day, so it's not something that could happen now, but there are some other experiments where these things were done. And relational needs, so that would be the essential elements people seek in their relationships with others. So that could be as far as getting things done, having love, affection, having a companion, your neighbors, people that you run into every day. So basically anything that helps you foster and build your relationships. And then we also have the identity needs. And when it comes to communication, the way we communicate and how we communicate about ourselves and to other people basically tells us who we are. So it could be like the way you address yourself. If you want to be called a certain pronoun, his, her, they. It could be like I want to be called Miss Mott in some situations. Or I could be called Mrs. Mott, depending on marriage status. So those are some identity needs. And then we have our spiritual needs. So the spiritual needs are basically the way people communicate with their own deity or their own God and in their own religion. So some people might meditate, some people might pray, some people speak in tongues. So there are various ways that people pray and connect to their own spirituality, and so those needs would be fulfilled with communication. We also have instrumental needs, and those are the needs that you need for everyday comings and goings. So that could be like ordering coffee, dropping your kids off, saying hello to the bus driver, basically to get things done. It could be cashing a check. All right, so the nature and types of communication. So starting with the action model, and with the action model, we can think of a person trying to communicate a message to someone else. So you have the source, which would be me, and I'm trying to communicate with somebody, and then I would have my message that I'm trying to get through, and the person has to actually receive this information. So when it comes to communication, it's not really about me, it's about the other person. So I know some people say that you shouldn't have to change the way you talk or speak to other people, but it actually isn't true. It's very important to speak to people on their level in a way that they can understand. So if you think about it, the way I would speak to, my grandmother would not be the same way I would speak to my friends. So it's very important that we speak in a way that the other person can receive the information or the message that we're trying to convey to them. So the action model is more of just me talking to somebody. The person hasn't responded yet. So with the interaction model, that is where the person responds. So you have the source, which would be me explaining something or trying to get a certain communication across. And then the person actually has to receive the message. They have to encode it, which is put it into their mind. They have to interpret it, and then they have to think about sending information out. And sending information out would be their response. So it could be like, do you want any cookies? That could be my message that I'm asking somebody, and they could think about it and think like if they've already eaten, or maybe if they've met their calorie quota for the day as far as how many calories they can eat or how much sugar they can intake, or maybe they feel it's too early. So the person is actually thinking, considering, like, or maybe they're thinking, what type of cookie? Like, is it, does it have nuts? I'm allergic to nuts, so they can't eat that cookie. So for them, they have to think about that information and they'll provide feedback. So with the interaction model, they'll either say yes or no. So yes, I love cookies, or no, maybe I'm allergic to that cookie, or I'm trying to cut back on sugar because we know sugar is really addicting. So that is part of the interaction model. And as far as the transactional model, so basically it's information going back and forth. So a person, me, I could be asking a question or making a statement, and it's going back to person 2 who has to respond, and then it goes back to me. So transaction model would be the same thing, but it's more like a conversation. It's a continual conversation. We're having feedback. There's different things that could get in the way. There could be noise, and it could be noise as in someone being loud, or it could be noise as in like if I were hungry and so I'm not really focused, or if you have other things on your mind, like maybe you're worried about how much sleep you're getting, or maybe your child's school keeps calling, so it's interrupting your focus, your concentration. So all those things could be part of noise, and that can interrupt your feedback when it comes to any of these three. So I happened to explain this on the initial slide, the last slide. So this is just going over the action model and how it's a one-way process. I talked about encoding and receiving the message, and as far as noise goes, and then a channel. So the channel, if you think about that, it could be a text message. That could be the channel that I'm sending this message through. It could be just for us talking in the same room. It could be a phone call. So there's different channels that we use to communicate. Going over the interaction model that I've already talked about on the last slide, but I'll add a little bit more to it. Basically, it treats communication as a two-way process, so two people are interacting. You have feedback, and you can include verbal feedback, which could be like a yes or no, or an actual sentence response, or it could be maybe if somebody will stiffen, like maybe if you ask, hey, do you want this peanut butter cookie, and they kind of stiffen up because they're allergic to it, or the person might look really excited, their eyes might get big because they really love cookies. So it just depends on the context. So when you're talking to people in any situation, it is very important to pay attention to nonverbal feedback as well as verbal feedback. And honestly, it's very important to sometimes pay more attention to nonverbal feedback because it'll give you more insight into what the person is dealing with, or if they're not really sure about something. but that's also very important to think about continuously. Alrighty, so the transaction model basically is a multi-way process, so it deals with all the ways of communicating. It's not just a person sending out the information, but it's also someone else responding to the information, and it's a continuous process. So you could think of this as more of a conversation instead of just a simple interaction. Over this slide, the nature and types of communication. So communication has many characteristics. It relies on multiple channels. So it could be the various ways that you're trying to communicate with somebody. Like I mentioned before, it could be through email, text message, talking in person, yelling across the room, yelling through a crowd. It could be if you're in a busy environment. Any of that could be a form of a channel. So it passes through perceptual filters. So a perceptual filter is basically everyone's perception. So you've probably heard the quote or the phrase that perception's reality, which is really, really true. So basically, depending on what the person's experiences in life have been, their experiences with communication has been, that can that deals with the way that they will perceive or interpret the message that you're trying to convey. And so meaning is given by people. So we all put meaning behind something. It just depends on the person, like I said, on their experiences. So some things have literal meaning, so it's like the exact, like Webster's dictionary meaning, and then there's other meanings also. So some people, you might say something literally, like you mean it to be real, but to them, it might just be a joke, or it might not be as serious, or maybe they think you're just being dramatic with the situation, so they might not take exactly what you said literally. So it depends on the relationship. If it's, if your boss tells you something, you would probably tend to think that they're not joking as much versus if your friend told you something. Like if your friend comes to you and says the sky is pink, you're going to be like, okay, yeah, whatever. But if, there was an official on TV, the president, or if it was the mayor of your city said something about the sky being pink, then you would take that differently. You would probably take it literally, thinking that, okay, maybe there's something wrong with the sky, maybe there's toxins, we should be careful. And then also with the thing about sending message, whether they're intentional or unintentional. So sometimes we send messages by the way we say things, like our voice might be aggressive, like maybe we're upset about something, or you might be somebody who finds yourself, you might describe yourself as blunt. And other people, if they're not used to someone being blunt, they might take that as aggressive or offensive. So it just depends. Also body language. So like if you have your arms crossed and someone asks you, do you want a cookie? And you cross your arms and say no, they might think, oh, this person has an attitude. Maybe they don't like me. Maybe they're insulted. Maybe they just hate cookies. But it could be just that you're cold in the moment, so you just happened to cross your arms and say no at the same time. But it just depends on how the person takes it and your relationship beforehand. And then it's governed by rules. So you can think of common rules, and these rules differ by culture and where people live. So if someone crosses their arms and it's a cold area, people might think, okay, they're just cold. But if you give the thumbs up sign here in the US, it's thought of as a good thing, like, okay, yes to whatever I'm saying, or you're okay with whatever we're just discussing. But in some other countries, it's actually sort of like giving someone the middle finger. So it just depends on the rules of the society that you live in. There are 5 types of common communication. We have intrapersonal. So if you think of intrapersonal, is more like the story that we tell ourselves inside our minds. It's more like you're talking to yourself. So maybe you're thinking, like you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh gosh, like I'm so tired this morning. Like you haven't said it out loud, but you're actually saying it in your mind. Or maybe you look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, oh, I look great today, or this color looks really beautiful on me. So that's interpersonal communication. It's communicating with yourself. Interpersonal communication is where you're communicating with someone else. So that's like if I tell my son good morning when he wakes up, tell my fiance good morning, give them both a kiss. So that's interpersonal communication, where you communicate with someone else. Small group communication is when you communicate in a small group, and small can be relative. For some people it's 3, it's 5, it could be up to 20 people, but you're communicating in some form. So that could be more of like maybe one of your classes on campus, or if you're in a book club or some other group, or sports teams. So that could be as far as small group communication. And then there's public communication, and that could be like a newsletter that gets sent out. It could be a newspaper, a podcast, things like that. And then mass communication would be like it's going to reach everybody. So radio, that also can be newspapers, television. So as far as like national news, and then for public, that could be more like local news. But mass communication is anything that can reach mass amounts of people. Oh, also you can think of Facebook, everything that goes viral, Instagram, Snapchat, and whatever else the young people use nowadays. Dispelling some communication myths. So these are the myths. So basically, they're not true. Everyone is a communication expert. So that's completely not true. Communication is actually a skill, and it is very important that it's a learned skill. So it's not something that we have automatically. And then communication will not solve any problem. Some people might think if we just talk about it, it'll fix it. Well, some people, they actually need to take time away. They need a break. So for them, it won't help it, or it might help resurface some issues that they don't want to deal with, or they can't deal with in the moment. Maybe they're in public and they don't want to cry in front of everyone. So communication will not solve every problem. So a myth says communication can break down. So you might think like, well, of course it can. There could be arguments or disengagement or confusion. Well, this is a myth because it's saying that communication itself doesn't break down. It's more like the people who are communicating might change their behaviors, or their perceptions might break down. So that's why that one's a myth. I know it seems a little bit confusing. Communication is inherently good. So sometimes it's best not to communicate with people. Like this person might have hurt you in the past, and it might be best for you emotionally and for yourself, your own personal growth, if you just stay away from that person. Or it could be like harassment at work or somewhere else, and you just know that you just need to avoid this person at all costs. And then more communication is always better. Well, some people will say it's like beating a dead horse. Like sometimes somebody will keep talking about an issue and you feel like, okay, I don't fully agree with you, but I see your point. We're just going to leave it at that. We can agree to disagree, but the person wants to keep going with the communication, and that can be frustrating. All right, building your communication competence. So competent communicators are effective and appropriate. So effective means that you're, as far as being competent with your effectiveness, it's just that whatever message you're trying to get across, it actually got across to the person. They actually have perceived it the way that you meant for them to perceive it. So there was no confusion. So you're very clear with whatever you're communicating. And then also make sure it's appropriate. So if you're talking to a little kid, of course, you're going to break down your words for them. Maybe use more layman's terms, which are easier, shorter terms, shorter words for people to understand. Or it could be maybe if you're talking to an older family member, you might not want to use these new slang words or anything like that because they might not understand. So just make sure it's appropriate for the situation. Always be aware of your audience. So continuing on with communication competence, it's very important that we have these characteristics and skills. So be self-aware. So be aware of the way you come off. Some people have RBF. Hopefully you remember what that means, or you can Google it, but I cannot say it. But basically, it's like when you have a face that's unapproachable, or what people think of as mean. So your face is just set that way. So be aware if, maybe if your boss or your teacher is talking to you, you might have that face on. Like, be aware that, like, you might need to respond instead of just nodding, so that way they don't misinterpret and think you have an attitude. It just might be the way your face is set up. So just constantly be aware of the way you present yourself, the way you come off. And it's not just the way you say things or how you say it or how loud your voice is or how soft. Also, it's the way your body is. Like, are you sitting up straight? Are you leaning forward towards the person as if you're interested? Are you leaning back like you're relaxed in a situation? So all of that is important. So also be adaptable. So you can also think of that as code switching. And that's just, like I said before, the way I speak to my grandmother is completely different than how I would speak to my friends. So just be adaptable to a situation. And have empathy. So when you're talking to somebody, you don't want to be mean or harsh or rude unless you're close to that person and it's time, a time and place for that. But it's very important to be empathetic. Like if someone's telling you something and sometimes they just really don't need you to, hound them or tell them how wrong they are. Maybe they just want somebody to listen. So use some empathy when it comes to these situations and try to interpret what does this person need from me? What are they asking for? They might just want you to listen, or they might want some advice. Also, cognitive complexity. So you're just thinking about how difficult is this message? Am I perceiving the message right? Am I interpreting it right? Should I maybe rephrase what they said to me and say it back to them so it's like, so they know that I understand what they're trying to say to me? So just know that when we're thinking and the way people are thinking, all of that is complex and it's difficult, and we have to keep that in mind when we're talking to people. And then as far as ethics, so ethics is very, very important. You basically don't want to do anything to hurt somebody, you know, when it comes to communications. So we want to have good judgment when it comes to right or wrong in situations. You don't want someone to say something to you and your automatic reaction is to, you know, come off really negative or yelling because maybe they didn't mean it that way. Sometimes it's good to give people a chance to explain what they meant because maybe they're just not good communicators. So we just need to have our ethics and continuously think about cognitive complexity as far as the situation and seeing if we could understand or interpret what they were trying to convey in a different way.